What do you think is the one thing that the royals most fear being exposed?
I've got information which demonstrated what Andrew had been doing. Whenever Andrew has a contact, they always appear to be rather dodgy contacts. Andrew's unsavoury circle of friends, and unsavoury they are indeed. Why would this be the case? Well, and the evidence which I've accumulated suggests that Andrew was not. Which is why I reported Prince Andrew. Charles I've got some time for. He's got bad judge of character. It's not just Peter Ball, who, by the way, admitted gross indecency as a consequence of whipping a 17-year-old boy for sexual gratification. He was also great fans of Jimmy Savile. He was very close to him. I reported him to the police eventually because
61% of regular Heretics viewers haven't subscribed yet. Can I ask you a favour? If you love these fearless conversations, hit subscribe now because it's free, takes 2 seconds and powers our mission. Join hundreds of thousands of fellow heretics, subscribe and let's question everything together. Norman Baker, welcome back on the show.
Thanks, Andrew.
I love what you're wearing. It's a lovely look. Very good to have on different
That's summer, isn't it?
It is summer. It feels like it. Nearly there. I want to talk about something less summery. Prince Andrew, is he concerned about the Epstein list? Wasn't the Epstein list supposed to come out?
The Epstein list, of course, is the great list that everybody's waiting for because everybody who's anybody will be on it, apparently. People who are key politicians in the States, in the UK, leading business people, all those who've visited Pedophile Island, whatever it's called, that Epstein used to have. They're all going to be on it. So I think it'll be appearing no time soon because all those who are on it will not want to have it appear. It was embarrassing enough to find out that in his little black book, he had all these different phone numbers for people. Lots of phone numbers for Andrew, of course, including private numbers in Sandringham and Buckingham Palace that you should never have had. And telephone numbers for even Peter Mandelson, who's now, of course, our representative in the US. So, I mean, that will not be coming out anytime soon. And all those people, the rich and powerful, will breathe a sigh of relief when Epstein died suddenly in prison.
That's interesting about the numbers. I didn't know about that. So how many phone numbers does Andrew have?
Oh, well, I think from memory about 10 numbers and he had numbers for Fergie as well. I mean, he collected them all. I mean, it was a kind of Bible of the great and the good.
What about like phone numbers that Epstein had for Andrew's? Like, this is me at the palace. This is me at another palace.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Why not just his mobile phone, or was it? Yeah.
Well, he had his mobile phone, obviously, but I mean, he had different numbers from different places. He just collected everything. And
so Epstein's just calling the palace and sort of this is Andrew's palace number.
I think so. Yeah.
So bizarre, the whole thing, isn't it? Do you think the MI5 protected Andrew? Did they get involved?
Well, I think there's a willingness to try to make sure the royal family's not any more embarrassed than it would be. But it only goes so far. I mean, MI5 is there to deal with threats to the country, not with threats to Prince Andrew.
Yeah, well, there are concerns about that with Andrew's business dealings and things like that. There's what was it that actually went on with that Chinese spy, and is that just one of many examples?
Well, Yang Tenbo is the latest embarrassment for Prince Andrew, who was identified by MI5 as a Chinese spy, in effect. He was excluded from the country by Suella Braverman, who was a Home Secretary at the time, despite the fact he'd been in Britain since 2002 and given indefinite leave to remain in 2013. So obviously matters have appeared on the radar since 2013 to cause that unusual reaction. It's not very common for people to be excluded from the country when they have a right to remain. But clearly there was something going on. But whenever Andrew has a contact, they always appear to be rather dodgy contacts. He doesn't seem to have any normal contacts, and again and again they appear in the papers. Why would this be the case? Well, first of all, I think that anyone who's down the straight and narrow will not necessarily want to do business with Prince Andrew. So he attracts, if you like a magnet, dodgy characters who think they can use him in some sort of way, and clearly Yang Tenbo, if it's true, what is said about him, was acting at least partly for the Chinese government and was gaining information from Andrew about the establishment and about how Britain works. Now, I don't think Andrew is not the brightest person in the world, and probably didn't even know that was happening to him. I don't think Andrew's a traitor, but I think he's rather stupid and also rather arrogant. And therefore, he would have given information out without knowing that he was giving information out to this Chinese person. And then, of course, we have the connections with this Dutch startup boot camp, a horrible name, firm, when Andrew, who's obviously short of money all the time because he spends it like water, and so does Fergie on his behalf, was going to sell this Dutch company through an intermediary. The thousands of contacts he'd built up at Pitchett Palace, this vehicle he started in 2014 to allegedly help business startups. Well, there's a couple of things about that. First of all, people who gave their information to Pitchett Palace did so, I suspect, in nearly all cases because they thought this was a charity, which it was. It was based in Buckingham Palace, which it was, and therefore had the approval in some shape or form of the British state. And people who gave their details to Andrew and Pitchett Palace in that capacity will not have been very keen, I suspect, to have their details sold on to some Dutch company in order to enrich Prince Andrew. And of course, there are data protection rules here, which is why I reported Prince Andrew to the Information Commissioner and said that the Information Commissioner should stop this sale of material because it was, in my view, against data protection legislation. And the Information Commissioner, to his credit, replied to me within 3 days, saying that the information had been passed on to the relevant section and pointing out, which I hadn't pointed out, but he pointed out in return, that many of the contacts were sole traders who would indeed be captured by data protection legislation. So it seemed to me that they were going to take some action to try to prevent that sale from going on. But that's just one of the examples of Andrew's contacts over the years. I mean, there's a litany of them. And in my next book, which I'm bringing out in the autumn, there's a chapter which is going to be headed Andrew's Unsavoury Circle of Friends. And unsavoury they are indeed. You know, he didn't follow the rules, not even Buckingham Palace's very loose rules he didn't follow. There are guidance, for example, Buckingham Palace for the members of the royal family about accepting gifts. They don't always adhere to them and there's no way of enforcing them, but the guidelines are there. So how could it be within the guidelines, for example, for Andrew to accept a holiday in Tunisia and an £18,000 bracelet for his daughter from a convicted Turkish gunrunner? If that's not outside the guidelines of accepting gifts, what is?
I get the impression when you speak about Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, that you feel like the real story is actually the corruption, the freebies, the breaking of rules. And it's almost, not that you would say it's a distraction, but it's almost like the Epstein stuff. Okay, yeah, potentially horrible. We don't fully know what Andrew did or didn't do. But this stuff we do know is happening and people aren't really looking into it.
I think that is the case. I mean, I'm not defending Andrew with Epstein in any shape or form. I mean, it seems to be pretty horrible behaviour from what we can learn. But in a sense, it's self-contained. There's an episode there, an issue there, which has been exposed by the press, and people can make up their own minds. I noticed that Andrew gave out, was it 13 million or 12 million to a woman he said he never met? Well, actually, I've never met Prince Andrew, so on that basis, perhaps you can give me £12 million. But I mean, that's self-contained, that particular issue. What hasn't come out in great detail and needs to come out is the fact that over 20 years since he stopped being in the Navy and in doing national service and the stuff he did quite bravely in the Falklands and so on, when it all came to an end in 2001, he was without a role. And in the old days, in Victorian times, someone like that, the heir and the spare, I mean, Harry's the heir and the spare now to William, but in those days, the heir and the spare was Charles and Andrew was next in line to the throne at that point before Charles started having children. Well, back in those days, in 2001, what do you do with the spare? What can you do with them? In Victorian times, he'd have been sent off to run some sort of colony in deepest Africa and no one had heard of him again. But that, of course, is not an option these days because there aren't any colonies, quite rightly. So What do you do with him? So he was given, very unwisely, he was given this role as a trade envoy to represent Britain abroad, which, by the way, Charles counselled against. So he knew the measure of his own brother before other people did.
That's interesting.
I think. So he went on this trade envoy role, and he went around like a kind of clod hopping around the world, like saloon bar mentality, insulting people left, right and centre, not representing British policy, alienating anyone who came across, and doing deals on the side for himself. And the evidence which I've accumulated suggests that Andrew was not representing Britain particularly, but representing himself in that trade envoy role. And that's been going on one way or another since 2001. When that finally came to an end in 2011, officially, after the publication of that infamous photograph of him and Jeffrey Epstein in Central Park in New York, when that happened, Andrew was removed of his role or forced to resign from his role, but he carried on anyway. He carried on doing the same sort of thing, but without the trade envoy label. And when people raised questions about that, next thing we knew is he started Picture Palace, which is basically another way of making contacts with dubious people. Not that the people who signed up to Picture Palace are necessarily dubious, but he did invite people in who were. And then when that finished, next thing is to try and recreate Picture Palace through Startup Boot Camp. He doesn't change. It's all about making money for himself. That's what motivates him. He's deeply unattractive, but he always gets found out because he has a unique ability to combine stupidity and arrogance, which does for him every time.
It does feel like the Epstein stuff is almost a cover now, because I don't hear people talking enough about the things you're talking about. You've had to go and you've worked in this, as you say, you've accumulated the evidence yourself in the form of a journalist, as a journalist. Andrew Lownie, he says that he tried to get all sorts of FOI requests. They were all denied, all sorts of... So who's hiding all the information about what Andrew was doing on these trade envoys?
Well, Andrew Lownie, or Lownie, I call him, I don't know which is the correct pronunciation.
Bowie.
Bowie on Bowie.
J.K. Rowling, no one knows.
Andrew's done superb work on this, by the way, and he's got a book coming out in the autumn as well. In fact, we've been in contact with each other to try to make sure that our books don't overlap too much, because there's plenty of other things to say, which I will be saying in my book, without going into what he's doing, which is going to be, I think, pretty good as well. But Andrew, has indeed had opposition to his request for information. Unbelievably so, in fact. His requests are deemed to be too wide and therefore too expensive, or too narrow and therefore they can't be answered. Whatever the reason is, he gets no information out. I've got information before 2008, because at that time I accumulated information, I think, from parliamentary questions, which demonstrated what Andrew had been doing. So I've got some information that's now no longer available. And it demonstrated, for example, he'd been to Qatar, I think it was, 9 times, and Bahrain, I can't remember the exact figures, but Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, multiple times in a way that could not be justified by Britain's trade interests. You go once a year or twice a year to sign contracts or do something. You don't go out, every couple of months. But he was doing that, and that was therefore not in Britain's interest. That was in his interest in some shape or form. He was going there. And if you look at where Andrew went in that period to 2008, which I've got information for, what do these countries have in common? First of all, they're all pretty nasty arrangements in terms of the rules which apply to those countries, and the dictatorships, or whatever,
theocracy,
or theocracies, or something, or they're not democracies, put it that way. Secondly, they generally have ties to Britain, particularly through the royal families in those cases, which makes them amenable to people from the royal family from Britain coming across. And thirdly, they have a tradition and an etiquette, a culture of being generous to esteemed guests. So add those 3 things together, and that might explain why Andrew was going to these countries regularly. Yeah,
not just going to sunbathe, was he?
I don't think so, no. Not unless he was topless with a nice accompaniment with him.
At least he wasn't sweating, though, if he was having a sunbathe.
Well, he couldn't, of course, could he?
And look, while the royal family might have all kinds of clever ways to manage their wealth, most of us don't have the luxury of secret exemptions or special tax deals written into law, which is exactly why I've been looking at ways to actually protect my own savings. I've partnered with Gold Co., one of the top precious metals companies out there, to help people like us diversify. Because let's be honest, the US dollar, it's lost its purchasing power since 1971. That's not a conspiracy, it's just data. But gold and silver have been trusted for centuries, and Gold Co. makes it really simple to get started. Whether you're looking at a precious metals IRA or just want to make a direct purchase, there's no minimum, and their team is incredibly professional, friendly, and helpful. Right now, you can even get up to 10% back in free silver on qualified accounts. So if you want to check it out, just head to andrewlovesgold.com. That's andrewlovesgold.com to get your free 2025 gold and silver kit. andrewlovesgold.com. The link is down below. Fergie said about him that she would marry Andrew all over it again. What do you read about that?
Well, in a way she has, because, I mean, they're never quite divorced, never quite married, are they, those two? I mean, you know, they're living in the same place, which is a curious arrangement. She's been very much defending Andrew at every opportunity. She said, I think, unless I misquote her, that he was the best man in the world. Well, I mean, you know, I think it's a stretch to come to that conclusion, but, you know, maybe love is blind. That's the only conclusion I can reach from what she's said. But she's also had a lot of dubious connections over the years. She took £15,000 from Jeffrey Epstein to help pay off her debts. She took money from David Rowland, this Tory banker, which will pay off her debts. She said, by the way, that the Epstein money had been a terrible mistake and she would pay it back. And when she was asked some years later, had she paid it back, she said, no comment, which I suggest the answer is the first word in that answer rather than the second word. It's probably what we can conclude from that. But she's also been caught on film with that fake reporter offering, you know, well, saying for £500,000 you can get access to Andrew, you know, selling access to Andrew. So she hasn't got a very unblemished record herself. So in a sense, both of them behave in the same sort of way.
Was that the fake sheikh?
Yes.
I remember that now. So that was someone pretending to be a sheikh from some Middle Eastern country.
Yeah, and saying, would you know, I want to achieve something. And she said, well, I can get access to Andrew, for example, and wanted £500,000 for it. So, I mean, you know, she's on record, she's on film with these things.
I suppose it's an awkward thing. You're born into this dynasty, family.
Well, she wasn't, of course, but yeah.
Well, of course, yeah. But Andrew, in Andrew's case, or yeah, I suppose you might marry into it as Meghan or as Fergie has done. And you're supposed to be dutiful, or do your duties for the country, and in return you get a handsome salary of sorts. But then you get perhaps offers. Hey, look, you know, I can meet someone and get loads of money, but I shouldn't because that's against. Yeah. You know, so it's complicated.
Well, look, the royal family is not accountable in the way they should be. Every other part of the public service in this country is accountable through rules and regulations which are enforced, through freedom of information, through laws. The royal family is exempt from these by and large, which means that if it wants to behave badly, is not going to be found out probably. At least that's the theory. So it does behave badly, and you have to rely on the members of the royal family behaving in a proper way. Now, do they behave in a proper way? I don't know. Some of them might do. I mean, Princess Anne might do. She's probably the best of the bunch in terms of propriety. But a lot of them don't. And the number of occasions when they've been rumbled and caught offering money for something they shouldn't, offered money for something they shouldn't want, they shouldn't be doing, and accepting that offer, or accepting gifts they shouldn't be accepting from people who shouldn't be offering them. Those sorts of things going on. And if you're not subject to FOI, Freedom of Information, then you have to exert yourself a sense of propriety and say no. And if you don't say no, will you get found out? The temptation is to accept something, and that's human nature. But it's particularly bad in the royal family when there is a general sense of entitlement, which has run through centuries of the royal family. And by the way, it doesn't run through royal families in Europe. They're quite different. If you look at the Scandinavian royal families and the Benelux countries, I mean, they don't behave in that way. It's only the British royal family that still behaves in this kind of imperial way, as the Russian Tsar would have done, or the German Emperor, or the Austrian-Hungarian Emperor, or the French King. You know, they're still in that mentality, that mindset from centuries ago.
Is that because they have more powers? I think those royal families are sort of only there to wave, aren't they?
Well, because I think they've accepted nowadays in the Benelux countries and Scandinavian countries that they are in democracies and they are figureheads who are there for a very limited purpose. They've accepted that. I was in Sweden while I was a minister, I think I was, and I was at this event, this kind of party thing, and I was chatting to this woman in the corner for about 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, I found she was a princess in the Swedish royal family. You cannot imagine that informality in this country. You just can't.
Did you get her number? Princess.
I'd be telling.
Yeah. I don't know how Meghan and Harry met, but I think it was similar circumstances. Wasn't it some sort of party and got chatting to one another and she'd never heard of him?
No. Well, that's probably the best way.
So she says.
But you see the Dutch royal family, they're out shopping and, behaving normally. And that's what people want. They want people who are normal the head of the country. They don't want what we have in this country where, if you're invited to Buckingham Palace or you're invited to meet one of the royal family, you have to all line up. And then, you line up, and then whichever the member of the royal family says, comes along the line and says something to you or doesn't say something to you. It's most bizarre the way they behave.
See, I feel in two minds about the royals, and I don't have very strong feelings either way, but I don't I'm obviously uncomfortable, as you say, with the lack of democracy involved and the lack of fairness, that there's just this family who just has money, has land, can do what they want, it seems to be unchecked. At the same time, we don't have much pomp and ceremony anymore in the country.
Well, you can have pomp and ceremony without a royal family, as a matter of fact. You don't have to have it. The palace in Europe, which is visited by most people, is the Palace of Versailles. And the French monarchy ended in 1848. Mm-hmm. In fact, you could argue if the British monarchy wasn't around, Buckingham Palace would have more visitors than it has now. Well, so you don't have to have that. You don't have to get rid of tripping the colour on. You can keep all these things. There's no reason to get rid of them. They're not necessarily a function of the royal family. You can keep what you like and get rid of what you don't like.
God Save the King and the sort of, the national anthem before the football.
Well, the national anthem, let's just talk about the national anthem. The national anthem should be there as a unifying song, which everybody in the country can sign up to, without exception. And most of them are around the world. Canada, oh Canada. Who's going to object to that? Particularly now, actually, with Trump and everything else at the White House.
Sure.
But people in Canada can sign up to Canada, oh Canada. I don't know anyone who doesn't. But this is the only national anthem in the world, as far as I know, which first of all requires you to believe in God, and secondly requires you to exalt one particular individual who happens to be the monarch at the time. And if you happen to be a Republican or don't believe in God, the national anthem is uncomfortable for you. Mm-hmm.
I think we've got an identity problem, though, because if it wasn't that, if we took the royals away, what would our national anthem shout about?
Well, you could either invent one, or you could annex one that's already there, like Jerusalem or something like that.
Well, what would the lyrics? We could, even Churchill. People don't like Churchill. They don't want Churchill statues.
You don't mention people, do you? You mention the country. You just mention the values. You mention the values of the country, the fairness, the justice. You can mention all those sorts of values, or you can mention the stuff that's really good about Britain. The environment, the countryside. You could create something. We got Flower of Scotland, which was used for rugby matches and so on. Mm-hmm. They're very happy with that. We can invent something down here for England.
Everyone wants it to be that Jerusalem song, don't they?
Well, Jerusalem's a very, very powerful anthem. And if you look at the French national anthem, of course, the Marseillaise, which is a wonderful song in terms of the kind of feeling. It's very kind of Gallic, but it just inspires you when you hear it, even if you don't understand the words. The words are quite brutal, as a matter of fact, but because they relate to the French Revolution. But it's a fantastic anthem. If you've ever seen the film Casablanca, which a lot of people have seen, and there's a scene in Casablanca where the kind of Nazis in the cafe are singing their kind of Stein songs. And the French exiles start up with the Marseillaise, which Humphrey Bogart says, okay, he tells them they can do it. And they sing the Marseillaise. And it's so powerful. And every time I see that particular clip of that film, I'm in tears, because it's just such a powerful moment in the film, and there's such a powerful song. And actually, I found out afterwards that the people who were singing it were all extras, and they were actually exiles from Nazi Germany.
Wow.
And therefore, it meant a lot to them, and it comes across in the film. But I'm sorry, this isn't necessarily anti-royal, but God Save the King is such a dirge as a song, it's not going to inspire anybody.
It's a bit flat. It's like one note. Duh, 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 duh. Well, it's two.
Yes, it's flat. Flat's a pancake.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, fair enough. We'll make a new one afterwards. We'll set the world to rights. And Jerusalem's also a religious one, isn't it? I suppose. But it's lovely. That is a beautiful song. Andrew and his kids, right? So are they also relying? It feels like there's almost like a mini mafia. This family of Fergie has to be nice and supporting because she's relying on that income. The kids as well. Are they also getting a lot of that?
Well, look, Andrew and Fergie are very supportive of their children, and that's a good thing because it's a nice family unit. So I think that works as a family unit. But it also means that they've been dragged into some of the stuff Andrew and Fergie have been doing, which isn't necessarily very helpful to them. Andrew was very insistent that they were called Princess before their names, and BHRH. Princess Anne, for example, never insisted on that for her children. And in fact, she took the view, rightly, I think, that they should have normal lives. And it's totally different to how Andrew has behaved. And he got very upset when security was taken away. Well, security is not a kind of there just to make them look good. It's there for a purpose, and there was no particular threat to Eugenie and Beatrice. So why was security there? It's not a status symbol.
That's what it feels like.
But it was a status symbol to them. Or not to the girls necessarily, but to Andrew, it's also a status symbol. So that's how he interpreted it. But he's also got Beatrice and Eugenie involved in some of the stuff he's been doing. And the startup boot camp thing I mentioned earlier on, one of them, I think it was Eugenie, I can't quite remember, was over making a speech in Japan, linked with all this. So she'd been dragged into it, and the papers reported on that. Well, she could do without that, really.
It's a bit of a mess, all of that, and I think obviously there's more to come. Your book about Andrew's out later this year, is it?
Well, Andrew Lownie's book's about Andrew. My book is largely about finance, which we haven't talked about very much so far. But on the finance stuff, let's just remember that the civil list, as it was, which existed from 1760 to 2011, in 2011 the civil list was 7.9 million a year. That's what they got, and there was transport on top of that. This year, the replacement sovereign grant is 125 million.
What?
Now, you have to ask yourself, who else has had that sort of inflation increase in the last 14 years? It's outrageous. And, of course, what happened in 2011 was that after lobbying from Charles in particular, over some time, George Osborne, the Chancellor, stupidly agreed to replace a civil list with a sovereign grant. And what the sovereign grant does, quite improperly, in my view, links the amount of money the royal family gets to the Crown Estate profits. Now, this is a bit complicated. The Crown Estate sounds like it belongs to the royal family, and they're very happy to give that impression, but it doesn't. The Crown Estate was given to the state in 1760 in return for the state giving George III an annual payment, which was called the civil list. So the royal family got rid of their property in 1760 in return for an income stream. And what Charles now is arguing that the Crown Estate really is royal. So he wants both the income stream and the Crown Estate. But he won't take back what the royals lost in 1760, because before 1760 they paid for the army and the civil service and everything else, customs. So is he going to pay with that himself out of his pocket? No, he isn't. So they want all the good things, none of the bad things. So the Crown Estate, being a property company, makes a lot of money. And being a property company, it makes more than inflation every year. And particularly, he's now got the seabed around Britain is making an absolute fortune from wind farms, because they are all in Crown Estate land. And that means that, at the moment, 25% of the Crown Estate's profits going straight into Charles's pocket. 25%. Money that should be going to fund schools and hospitals and maybe foreign aid and everything else is now going straight to one of the richest families in the country because of the deal George Osborne did. It's outrageous. Wow. It's theft.
Yeah. I can see you're passionate about it. I guess because people just go about and they don't really know about this, do they?
No, they don't. And of course, the other thing that's happened since 2011 is there used to be an annual debate in Parliament about the civil list. That's now been abolished. And the sovereign grant is now determined by the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and one member representing the royal family, Lord Chamberlain or someone like that, representing the royal family. They're who decide the sovereign grant. And by the way, here's a nice little trick as well. The sovereign grant can go up or stay the same. It can never go down. So that if the Crown Estate makes an absolute fortune, they benefit. If the Crown Estate, for some reason we can't envisage, suddenly lost its marbles and lost its money coming in, it wouldn't affect the royal family because they're protected. They've got a safety net. So they go up all the time. So there's 125 million. It's not going to go down any time. It can only ever go up. I mean, what an arrangement that is. Who else in the country's got that arrangement?
I suppose some people are thinking, as much as that is, on a countrywide scale, the money doesn't make so much difference to things like benefits and those kinds of, because then you're talking about billions, aren't you?
Well, you are, but I mean, look, they set a symbol. They set a precedent for the rest of the country.
Yeah.
And there are people at the top of the echelon, top of the pyramid. And, if they're behaving that way, then why should people further down the pyramid behave differently? Mm-hmm. And I'm going to come back to European monarchies. Some of them are operating for £5 million a year, or 10 million, or 20 million. I think the most expensive beyond Britain's a Dutch one, I think, at 40 million. But it's a fraction of what ours cost. 125 million is only the tip of the iceberg, because that's what they quote. But there's also the money from the Duchy of Cornwall, 20-odd million a year, from the Duchy of Lancaster. These are property holdings which should belong to the state. And they do, and they're regarded now as so-called private estates, by the way, on which no corporation taxes pay, because they exempt themselves from that as well. Those properties cannot be royal properties. I'll tell you why. Because before 1800, it was illegal for the king to own property. So those two estates, which existed before 1800, by definition, were not owned by the king. They've just been annexed. And that's theft. That's 20-odd million pounds a year from the Duchy of Cornwall, 20 million from the Duchy of Lancaster, straight in some royal slush fund for Charles from the Lancaster Duchy and William from the Cornwall Duchy. And there's more. If someone dies intestate in this country, what happens? The money eventually goes to the Treasury, but not if you die in the Duchy of Cornwall. If you die intestate in the Duchy of Cornwall, the money goes to the Duchy of Cornwall.
What does testate mean?
Without a will.
Right.
And if you die without a will in the Duchy of Lancaster, the money goes to Charles. Now, they say it's after a lot of fuss. It never used to be the case. And by the way, during the Second World War, when soldiers were dying in those areas, serving king and country, the king was collecting the money that he left because there was no will. That's what happened to those soldiers who died, who happened to live in Lancaster, Duchy of Lancaster area, so during the Second World War. Now, they say now they've amended their procedures and the money goes to charities. Well, first of all, it goes to charities which are very, very closely connected with the royal family. Mm. Secondly, they have costs, apparently, administrative costs, which are 15% last time I checked the Duchy of Cornwall, which goes straight into the Duchy of Cornwall coffers. That's another way of making money for the royals. Then there's all security, which is probably £200 million a year for security, because we are protecting minor royals no one's ever heard of and who are under no threat whatsoever. If the security service had got knowledge that there's a threat against someone, of course it should protect them. But, I mean, I'm sorry, who's going to bump off the Duke of Kent? Nobody. Why have you got security protecting him or these people? You and I are under more threat than they are. No, absolutely. And if you look at someone like, let's pick a popular and very, very well-known person. Justin Bieber, he's Canadian, but let's pick on David Beckham or something like that. David Beckham. I'm sure there are people who got in for David Beckham, but no one's suggesting that you give 24-hour security to David Beckham and the odd chance someone want to take a pop at him. He'd pay it himself. And so should the royal family if they're that worried about it. And Harry's beef, by the way, it's just incredible to me. He said he won't come to the UK because he's worried about his security. How many people died from shotgun wounds in the UK last year? Less than 50. How many people died from shotguns or guns in the United States? I've forgotten the figure. I think it's 20,000 or was it 30,000 or 40,000? I mean, it's incredible. How could you think America's safe and Britain's not safe? None of that makes any sense. That was a digression. But I mean, the fact of the matter is that they're costing an absolute fortune. There's also the exemptions from law, which they benefit from. Mm-hmm. Do you know what this is? This is called an arrangement where it's not royal assent. It's an approval by the King or Prince of Wales in advance of legislation being put before Parliament. When legislation is drafted, if it affects the private interests of the royal family is sent to them for comments. And if they object to it, then the legislation is changed. Now, this is all done by telephone calls. And when the legislation is formally sent to them, King's consent it's called, then, of course, nothing changes because it's all been sorted beforehand by telephone. But, they give themselves exemptions. Charles has got an exemption from the Explosions Act. I don't know what they think he's going to be doing on, playing with fireworks at Tintagel. But I mean, he's got an exemption from that. Why has he got an exemption from that? Why is it that the Animal Welfare Act 2006, when I was in Parliament, I was in the relevant committee, and that allowed the RSPCA to enter properties where they believed that maltreatment of animals was taking place, a right of entry, except the royal family exempted their own palaces at Sandringham and Balmoral from that condition. Now, I don't think they were busy torturing animals, but they just apply for exemptions to everything.
Just to be above the law.
Just to be exempt from everything, to be above the law.
They presumably have a legal team who just do this without...
Yes, absolutely, and they're very vociferous about this. And, of course, the king is above the law because all legal action in this country is taken in the name of the king. So if he went to murder someone, he could not be charged with a murder because he's above the law, literally above the law. Mm-hmm. When the Queen, it's a minor matter, but when the Queen was caught not wearing a seatbelt when she was driving, she couldn't be prosecuted for that because she was above the law. Compare that with what's happening in some of that Spain, where the King's been hauled up for various matters. Compare that with what happens in the Netherlands.
I haven't even seen that. I remember seeing that King at the tennis. He looked very dapper with his suits and things.
Well, I'd hope he looked dapper. Yeah. But no, I mean, the point is they are not above the law in other countries. They are subject to the law. But that's because in other European monarchies, they regard themselves now in the 21st century as subject to the democracy of the country. It's only in this country we are regarded as subjects of them.
Yeah.
We are subjects, so that when you get elected to Parliament, the first thing you have to do before you can take your seat is take an oath of allegiance to the King, his heirs and successors. His heirs, of course, include Prince Andrew, for example, and Harry and everybody else along the line. And if you don't take that oath of allegiance, you don't take your seat in Parliament. You can't take your seat. And, even if you have a situation, let's say theoretically, where a government was elected with a majority or based on a manifesto commitment to abolish the monarchy, they would all have to take an oath of allegiance to the King to take their seats before they voted to abolish him.
That is mad. That is mad. And look, I still, like I say, I like that there's something to hang our hat on as a unifier in the country when we have fewer and fewer of them. But I don't think it's an ideal situation. And what you're saying, I mean, that is just mind blowing. The abuse of finances and things like that. What about Charles? What was happening with this Ball fella?
Well, Peter Ball was, of course, a Bishop of Lewes, which is in my area, and he was very well known to Charles and regarded as some sort of confidant. But then other people were as well, like Jimmy Savile. In Charles, I got some time for individually. He's probably more to the left of the royal family than most of them are. And he's got environmental concerns, which I happen to share. So I agree with what you said. I disagree with his right to say so, which is the opposite of Voltaire.
I see.
But I mean, he's got bad judge of character. This is a problem. I mean, he doesn't assess people very well. It's not just Peter Ball, who, by the way, admitted gross indecency as a consequence of whipping a 17-year-old boy for sexual gratification, I suppose.
Was that part of the choir or something in church?
I can't remember if it was part of the choir or not, but I mean, he was certainly singing, I imagine, at that point. But I mean, he was, Charles knew this. And yet he took the side of the bishop against the 17-year-old boy who said that, he called him that ghastly man, the boy who'd been beaten. And the boy was so traumatized he committed suicide. Well, I don't think Charles said very much about that when it happened. He was also great fans of Jimmy Savile. Yeah. And he was very close to him. Jimmy Savile, can you believe it, advised him and Diana on their marriage. How's about that then, is what I say to that. And he and Camilla, by that point, were the cheerleaders for Savile. Charles went to his cottage, and when he died, Charles and Camilla were thrust out of the traps to defend him and say what a marvellous person he was. You don't see that very much, that coverage on TV anymore, but the BBC should pull out those rushes.
So they were doing that, and then days later, it all came out about Savile.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. But they were congratulating him until such time as all this appeared. The thing was, he'd been told about all this. Charles had been told about all this, and he dismissed it all because he said it was all jealousy. He thought it was jealousy. But people who tried to help him and say, stand back from this guy.
Yeah.
And he hadn't stood back from him.
Because people knew. I mean, a lot of people in the industry knew. Louis Theroux knew.
Yeah, well, everybody knew. Look, I mean, I know from my transport, having been transport minister, back in the 1980s, okay, the guy who was in charge of legal matters for British Rail, I met him about 10, 15 years later. He told me British Rail knew about Savile because they'd had some suggestion, some evidence that he'd been interviewing in dead bodies, put it that way, in Stoke Mandeville Hospital, in the morgue. And they dropped him like a hot potato because he'd been doing this as the age of the train, and he'd been dropped. The BBC knew about him because he was kept well away from children in need, although he wanted to do it. So people knew about this guy, but no one did anything about it. And people told Charles, and he wouldn't listen to them. But he also had dealings with a Turkish millionaire, Semuzan, and if that's a correct pronunciation, who paid £200,000 to sit next to either him or his wife at some do. That's a big sum to pay. Well, he turned out to be a rather dodgy character. Then you've got this image of Charles accepting 3 million euros, £2.6 million in Fortnum & Mason carrier bags or a holdall from the former Qatari Prime Minister as a donation to his charities. And I'm perfectly sure that the money went to his charities, the Prince's Trust and so on. I'm perfectly sure that went in the right direction. But, did he not stop to think, as Prince of Wales that he then was, the image of this 2.6 million euros in Fortnum & Mason carrier? Okay, it wasn't Tesco's, but it was Fortnum & Mason. But even so, what did that look like? Look like a mafia boss receiving money. You just don't do that when you're in that position as Prince of Wales. And there's been other examples too. So, he's not a good judge of character. And, I reported him to the police eventually because there was a letter signed by his sidekick, with whom he's got an extremely close relationship, Michael Fawcett.
Yeah.
Michael Fawcett's letter in black and white basically said, if you give some money to the Prince's charity, we'll help you with your nationality application, and we'll we'll try and get you an honour bumped up.
Wow. So for immigrants coming in, if you help with the charity?
We'll try and get you your nationality sorted out, and you can also we'll bump your honour up. Here's someone already. Wow. We'll bump it up to the next level. Well, and it was there in black and white. I took it to the Metropolitan Police. It took about 18 months to do nothing, and then said they weren't going to do anything about it. I mean, it's just absolutely shocking. And, you compare that with what happened in 2003, I think it was, when I was an MP, and Peter Mandelson, who was then 2001, I think it might have been, was then Dome Minister, remember the Millennium Dome, before it became the O2. And he'd been scrabbling around for money for different zones in the Millennium Dome. And he'd found most difficulty in getting money for the Faith Zone. And he finally got £1 million, I think it was, out of the Hinduja brothers, in return, as it turns out, for helping them with the nationality application. And I found this out. I asked a question in Parliament of Jack Straw, who was the Home Secretary, and he conceded or admitted that Mandelson made representations on behalf of the Hindujas for their nationality. He admitted it. And good for Jack Straw because he answered the question properly that I'd asked him. And Mandelson had to resign. Well, Charles didn't resign for the same thing, did he? Exactly the same thing.
What do you think is the one thing that the royals most fear being exposed?
Money. Absolutely money, because they have accumulated a huge amount. They put great store in accounting on absorbing money from the state, from individuals who will be stupid enough to give it to them, from people who give things, free kitchens and everything else, free cars, as Aston Martin comes his way. They don't declare gifts properly. If they're deemed to be private gifts, there's no register kept at all, unlike MPs and councillors and everybody else who have to keep a list of these things. The royal family doesn't. They love to accumulate money as if there's no tomorrow. And I think they're extremely vulnerable on money. Wow. And that's what I hope will come out in my book, and indeed, as far as Andrew's concerned, Andrew Lownie's book.
Where will people be able to get your book and follow your work in general?
Well, I mean, they can buy the previous book, of course, which is called "And What Do You Do?"
You always do the voice when you talk about it.
What the royal family don't want you to know, which I might say has people have told me has moved monarchists into Republicans because they had no idea the detail which was going on, and it's not very attractive what the royal family's been doing. So that's already there. It's out in the bookshops, all good bookshops and some bad ones as well, no doubt. And it's available on Amazon and everything else. And that's published by Biteback. Biteback are publishing the next one. And if I can get around to finishing it on time, I'll finish it by the end of May, and it'll be in the shops hopefully in September.
Who's a heretic you admire?
Well, I never call her a heretic. I was trying to think about this, Andrew, because you tipped me off on this one question for the benefit of your viewers. No other questions have been given to me in advance, but that one was. And I'm going to call her a heretic, but maybe it's a heretic. It's Helen Suzman. And Helen Suzman was a South African MP in the apartheid years. And she was the only Liberal elected to the South African Parliament. I think it was Cape Town. I might be wrong on that. But she was elected into this mass of racist apartheid supporting men in the National Party. And they were nearly all men. I think they might have been all men, actually, who were all horrible. And she was someone who didn't choose that role, but she found herself in it. And she either had to capitulate or stand up for what she believed in, and she stood up for what she believed in. And she did so against this barrage of horrible men in the South African Parliament. And she also went out and, she went to meet all the black people and said, "You haven't got any MPs. Well, I'm the newest you've got, so I'm going to represent you as well." She was an extremely brave woman. And in that situation, that was the time Mandela was in prison. So you could either be, I'm not knocking Mandela, and he did it his own way, and he was locked up for it, and she did it her way within the confines of the South African Parliament, and she was extremely brave. So as far as the apartheid regime was concerned, she was heretical.
That's a great heretic. People, please go and get Norman Baker's book. The previous one, What Do You Do? And the next one coming out in May, you say? September. You'll finish it in May and get it out by September. He's great guest. And I think it is, whether you're a monarchist or not, I think it's worth knowing this stuff. Get the book, hit the like, keep watching the channel.